Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today I'll briefly talk about another aspect, sort of a nuanced aspect of Abdul Razak Gurnah's novel Paradise. And this is about the question of ambivalent identities during colonial times. Now, if you have studied traditional post-colonial studies, just like me, we usually tend to see things in a very binaristic perspective, right? There are the colonizers and there are the colonized, and we tend to see the colonized as a monolithic group. But a careful study of post-colonial literature and history would also remind you that individual and collective identities were sometimes more ambivalent than that. I had actually brought it up in my first book, Constructing Pakistan, where I had argued that the Muslim loyalism towards the British, if just looked at from the point of view of Indian national politics of freedom, would come across as a suspect practice, but for the Muslims, it made perfect sense, and it was a sort of resistant practice. Now, in the novel, we already know that there are Germans who are present on the fringes of the story. They are the ones who are the colonizers. Then there is Aziz, who is our Arab trader, right? And other characters, Yusuf and others. And then there are the native tribes, the territory that they travel through. So the first divide is between the native African population of the region and the Arab trader, and what does the figure of the Arab trader represent, right? Now, traders by their very profession are not aligned with one single territory or one single nation. Their interest is in getting the trade done, in making sure that they can securely travel through a territory and make their exchanges and thus earn a profit. Aziz is also an Arab trader. Now remember, the Arab traders appear in different novels and novelistic traditions. The three early novels of Conrad, remember, Abdullah is the Arab trader who's competing with the European traders. But one ambivalent space or experience within the novel is when the trading convoy or the trading group is being held captive by the local chief of an African tribe. I think his name is Choto. And they're holding them captive. The reason they're holding them captive is not because they are Arabs or they are different or outsiders. The reason they are holding them captive is because they suspect they are aligned with all those other traders who capture slaves and sell them to the Europeans. Because remember, slaves were captured by people in the interior of Africa and then transported to the coast to be shipped. So that's the grievance that the local African leader and his people have against the Arab traders. And the ambivalent moment emerges when the German colonizer or whatever administrator marches in with his armed guards. And at that time, Aziz turns towards the Germans to give him justice, but also to technically get him free. So that is the ambivalence, where his loyalty, instantaneous loyalty at that moment, or his interest is aligned with the order that the colonizers are bringing. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind, because it's not natural that the Arabs would be inclined towards the colonizers. It's the location within the economy of a trader who has to rely on not a tribe or a culture, but whosoever can restore order or law. And in this case, that happens to be the German administrator, right? So keep that in mind. That is a very important part of the novel, and to tease it out and discuss it in ambivalent terms rather than the binary terms is important. Now, in African literature, West Africa, but also here in East Africa, this divide, the Arab-African divide, is pretty peculiar, right? The Muslim Arabs and the native tribes. Even in the novel, you see that people whose continent it is, the African people, they are on the very fringes of the story. And they are often represented as these either exotic figures or figures about whom we don't learn much, we don't know a lot. But that's one moment where the ethnic, religious, and the trade identity of the trader aligns his interest not with the native people, but with the colonizers. The second ambivalent moment, in my opinion, happens towards the end of the novel. Okay, as Yusuf leaves the house of his master Aziz, because he realizes he has no power there, and his position within that system is limited. He cannot do much, and he's running towards the soldiers, right, led by the German sergeant. We don't know whether he'll join them, but that's where his hope is. That's what he thinks will change the status quo for him, or maybe there's a hint there. So it is important to tease these ambivalences and differences out while discussing post-colonial novels, instead of lumping the natives on one side and the colonizers on the other side. No, I'm not apologizing for colonialism. What I'm suggesting is that different constituencies had different interests and hence different loyalties during the colonial system. Now, this was highly discussed, and there is a developed book on it by Albert Memmi, right? The Colonizer and the Colonized, where he talks about the colonization of Algeria and points to the relationship of the Jewish inhabitants of Algeria and their loyalties to the French instead of their loyalties being with the Algerian people. And the reason, of course, was that they were a business class, right? And they had no position in the native society. They were outsiders already. And then the colonial experience places them in this middle location where their interests get aligned with the French. And it's important to keep these nuanced aspects of colonial experience in mind, because that can help us understand our story better, also understand history better. Now, if you apply it to, let's say, politics of Indian freedom, as I discussed in my book, Muslims, post-1857 rebellion, Muslim elite at least, developed their identity as those who want to be part of the British hegemonic project and want to work with the British. Because as the Pakistan national movement emerges, they realize that without the help of the British, they can't successfully argue for a separate homeland for Muslims. And so that is what defines their loyalties and their interest in opposition to the larger interests of the Indian freedom movement. And so knowing these nuanced historical and practical reasons is important in understanding history, but in also understanding novels such as Gurnah's Paradise. I hope this was useful to you. Thank you so much for being a part of my life. Please take care of each other, be generous, and I will now see you next time from the Ohio River Valley. Until then, peace and love.